Hello. So, trying something a little new before we start the stream, and decided to do a little intro before we actually get on with it. So, you might remember recently we discussed the JTB theory of truth, and we've discussed other theories of truth in the past, and we focus on skepticism a lot, and in this stream, we're sort of going to blend the two together, looking at a different kind of epistemology. That's virtue epistemology. And whilst this episode will not be a deep dive into virtue epistemology, we will be looking at the basics of it. And then we're going to use skepticism as an example of virtue epistemology. If we consider skepticism, at least skepticism as often promoted in the atheist or skeptic community online, we see one of the driving forces is to avoid believing false things or untrue things. So we'd agree that the quest for truth and knowledge is a virtuous trait, yet what if the methods of skepticism that are being applied also mean that we end up rejecting true things? We see that all the time when people talk about the polysemous nature of atheism. Sorry, mind went blank there for a second. So what makes skepticism virtuous? And what is virtuous skepticism? These are the kind of things that we're going to be discussing tonight. But ladies and gentlemen, we're not going to be discussing this for at least another half hour. What I'm going to do is get back to having one of the pre-stream mixes. Now, if you're watching live, then you're going to have a mix for the next half hour. If not, I will cut this out within the next couple of days. It takes a while for the videos to trim. So if you're going, what mix, what music, what are you talking about? I am talking about music that you can find in the section on the playlist known as Plato's Rave. Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave.
And yeah, we're here. We're here. And we noticed actually last stream that there weren't any technical issues when we actually started up. So I figured I'd try and encourage one today by doing a mix before the stream. So if you did catch us live, you saw some stuff I'd been playing around with. And if you're catching the rerun, you might be going, what mix? Because I tend to cut them out within a couple of days. But we're not here to discuss music as much as I love the topic. And I would like to learn a little bit about the philosophy of music. And I am planning on looking into it. But, time and things like that. But today, we're here to look at skepticism and ask the question, is it a virtue? Aren't we, Dave?
Yeah. We'll be discussing a little bit of virtue epistemology at the beginning, just to sort of set a scene. And we are hoping to do a bigger discussion on virtue ethics in the future. So this will just be an introduction, and then we'll look at an example of it in action, which is skepticism. Look at why it's a virtue, how it can become a vice, hence the question in the title. And we'll just explore and look at some kind of examples of when skeptics go wrong.
Yeah, most definitely. I think we should start with like a really basic set of definitions of what we mean by things like virtue and epistemology and skepticism, just so, and maybe with a couple of examples, just so people can get an understanding on where we're coming from, not just thinking we might be talking about something else. So let's start off with, Dave, what is a virtue?
Well, when most people hear the term virtue, they think of something like Christianity promoting virginity and, those kind of things. But what Aristotle meant was just excellence of, in virtue ethics, it's kind of excellence of character, but it's just a virtue is something that you do with excellence. And it's sort of the midway between a vice one way and a vice the other way. So courage is the virtue, cowardliness is one vice on one end, and I guess it would be arrogance, stupidity on the other
brave.
end. Overly brave, yeah, overly confident, I guess.
That would make sense.
So that's what a virtue is. It's just an excellent trait to be found in somebody.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If anyone's got any questions on that, please let us know. But we're going to continue now. So what do you mean in general by epistemology?
Okay, so epistemology is the study of knowledge, basically. What is knowledge? How do we get knowledge? Can we get knowledge? What sort of properties does knowledge contain? And there's many different theories of knowledge. We discussed the JTB a couple of weeks ago. So that's basically what knowledge is. It's how do we know something? When do we know something? Can we know something? Questions like that.
Yeah, that's true. We've actually done an overview video as well on the main theories of knowledge, and then we did a deeper dive, as Dave mentioned a couple of weeks ago, about the JTB. So when you're talking about virtue epistemology, how do those two link, Dave?
Okay, let's think of the JTB theory of knowledge here for a second. The JTB theory is about the object of knowledge. So if you want to claim you know something, you have to have a justified true belief, and that's what makes it knowledge. So it's focusing on the objects and the properties it must contain, the necessary and sufficient conditions, so to speak. But in the case of virtue epistemology, it's slightly different. If you think about virtue ethics and the difference between deontology, utilitarianism, I guess, preference, satisfaction, they're all about the objects of what makes something good or, moral. And in the sense of virtue epistemology, it's kind of like that. To have knowledge is to just reason in a virtuous way to get to the knowledge. Knowledge still has to be true. But the justifications for it, rather than coming from external justifications, they kind of come from you. It's how you behave in getting to the knowledge that makes it knowledge, rather than the object of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the key things that's different about virtue ethics in general than the other sorts of normative ethical theories, isn't it? Their deontology is sort of following rules, and it's about if you follow those rules. And consequentialism is about, the consequences of the action. So they're very action-based, whereas virtue ethics is very much the behavior that you're doing and your reasoning behind doing that behavior and trying to get it right, which should result in a good consequence, but it's a lot more internal. It's about the agent rather than the action.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about virtue ethics, one of the things that makes it a virtue is that you've thought about it, you've taken your time in your head to work out what should be the right action. So it kind of encourages a kind of mindfulness about your behavior. Virtue ethics kind of does, virtue epistemology kind of does the same thing when it comes to knowledge. You have to think about how you're getting the information, where you're getting it from. Have you checked that information? Have you done your due diligence? That kind of thing. But there's a whole bunch of virtues that go with the acquisition of knowledge. Just as there's a whole bunch of virtues for virtue ethics itself. Some of them kind of cross over, like mindfulness.
Would temperance or anything like that cross over?
Yeah.
Or prudence, perhaps?
Honesty. Yeah, honesty kind of crosses over because you have to be honest about how much you know. You have to be honest where if what you're reading goes with your opinion, you don't skip that and go on and just read only that which matches your opinion. You have to read both sides. So hence you got open-mindedness.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like a whole bunch of those virtues that go into it. And I'll sort of introduce a lot of them when we discuss the skepticism.
Right, I suppose we do need to move on to the skepticism bit. Now, we have discussed skepticism a number of different times, and there's lots of different sorts of skepticism. But what form of skepticism are we using for today's conversation?
Virtue epistemology style skepticism.
Okay, and how does that differ from, say, how the colloquial skeptic will use it?
Well, most of the time online, like you say, the colloquial skeptic is basically just show me evidence, provide me with evidence. Once I have evidence, I'll believe.
So a form of evidentialism in a way.
Yeah, but like hyper-evidentialism for a lot of them.
Especially as it tends to be, it has to be scientific evidence only.
That's it, yeah. And so if you were to think about virtue epistemology skepticism, open-mindedness is one of them. So you have to be open to types of evidence other than that. And the reason you should be open to it is because you've been mindful and you've learned that there are several types of evidence. One type of evidence might not fit one situation, another type might not fit another. So saying testimony isn't evidence isn't really correct, because if you're thinking properly, you'll know that testimony, there are certain times when testimony can be evidence and is used as evidence.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. So say you have another virtue then, and that's courage. So have the courage to admit
when you're
that
wrong.
maybe you, yeah. Have the courage to go against what's commonly claimed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't be so stupid as to think you're being courageous when you go against the flat Earth, the globe Earth with flat Earth. That's not being courageous. That's not doing your due diligence, which is another virtue. Yeah. So you have to, before saying you know something, you have to admit that you've done your due diligence, looked at both sides or all three sides, however many sides there are. And of course, that again goes back to thoughtfulness or mindfulness, because you're being constantly thinking about, have I looked at the right stuff? And once you satisfy, sorry. Yeah. And balance is another virtue, say, because you're making sure that you're tempering your opinion based on what you found. Honesty, that kind of thing. So you have to meet all these virtues in order to say you're actually doing skepticism properly.
That sounds a lot more deep and intertwined than you generally hear of that sort of thing online, doesn't it?
It kind of is, yeah. And some of the advantages that something like virtue epistemology skepticism gives us is when you think of the Gettier problems. Well, they seem to fit the properties of JTB, but it's an example of when it's not knowledge. So virtue epistemology can kind of overcome that by saying, well, that's because you're looking at the object of the knowledge rather than how you acquired it. In the Gettier cases, none of those answers were acquired by a virtuous means. They were just lucky. So it wouldn't be knowledge, according to virtue epistemology.
Nice. Yeah, okay. So it sort of gets around the old Gettier problems.
Yeah, and like we've mentioned many times before, the brain-in-a-vat. And people say, well, you could be a brain-in-a-vat, so therefore you can't know anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the answers for that we commonly give is that you still know things within your environment. And so virtue knowledge would overcome that skepticism problem, because if you've acquired your knowledge virtuously, it doesn't matter what the greater picture is. You've still acquired that knowledge. You still know you have hands because you're having this experience report hands. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
And most people don't live in worlds that are sci-fi worlds.
Or
You
do
know,
we?
Or do we? Yeah. So you can say, well, these are crazy, outlandish claims. So until you can show those claims, I'll be a bit skeptical that that's the case, and it doesn't seem to overcome you saying you have knowledge in your hands, because this slim possibility exists that you could be a brain in a vat.
Yeah.
You still have this experience, so therefore, knowledge.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Question from Mark. Glad you're back, Mark. I do apologise that the mix was hurting your hangover. He says, can virtue be a vice?
No. Sort of in the words. Because virtue sort of comes from how the behavior is.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in the vice territories, you can't be in the virtue territory, basically.
Unless, could you be someone, as in, it's not virtue itself, I mean, it's slightly changing it. You attempt to be so virtuous that it becomes a vice.
Yeah, but then you wouldn't be being temperate.
No, you wouldn't.
So you wouldn't be behaving virtuously anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, so I suppose to answer that then, Mark, the only way that it can really happen is when you're not behaving virtuously, but you're trying to, but failing.
Yeah. Or believe you're behaving virtuously, but
when you're not.
Everybody from the outside sees it as a vice.
There you go. So, hopefully that's given you all an overview of what we mean by virtue epistemology, and skepticism within virtue epistemology. So, Dave, where do we lean from here?
Well, I guess we could sort of explore a couple of scenarios.
Okay.
Now, I was watching Massimo Pigliucci, a philosopher, and he did a speech a while back. And one of the examples he used is a letter from the 80s, like a manifesto from scientists, decrying astrology.
Right.
And the story is that it was sent around to all these scientists. Most of them signed, but a couple held back. One was a philosopher of science, and one was Carl Sagan.
Right.
And all the others had signed because they were in a rush to decry pseudoscience.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to stop magical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And they had this manifesto and explained why. Now, all the scientists just signed up to it. And in the manifesto, it was things like, well, it existed during times when people believed in magic. And it comes from a time when people believe in magic. And we haven't confirmed any kind of mechanism that might work for this, that could make it true. And a bunch of others, basically. And Carl Sagan said, I'd love to sign this, but you have some stuff that's in error there. You haven't done your due diligence on the actual explanations. Because if it came from a time when people believed in magic and that made it bad, well, then science is bad. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's not enough of a justification on its own.
No. And that's it. If they want to justify it for astrology, then they have to admit that science is bad. And you don't really want to take that route because, it's kind of false.
No, and there's plenty of good reasons to poo-poo astrology.
Yeah, that's it. And that's what he said. You know, there's lots of more valid reasons for this, like it simply isn't true. You find no correlations. There's much better arguments.
Yeah, one of the funny things about astrology is, I mean, I used to do this at work. People would, you'd get the horoscopes up and you'd ask people what their star sign was, and then you'd
Yeah.
read out a completely different one, and they go, "Oh my god, that's so me," and that's so happened. It's like, because the statements are generally so vague that people can attribute it to anything in their life.
That's it. They apply to you, your neighbor that side, the neighbor the other side. You know what I mean?
And they can be
On
fun to
Sunday.
read, you know, if you realise they're entertainment. And I have a friend who doesn't believe in them at all, but he takes time out of his day and uses it almost as a bit of self-reflection. He reads that bit there and he goes, you know, is there anything I actually need to do about this sort of thing? Because he realizes it's a general behavior. He's a psychotherapist, and he realizes that this is very general, but he sits back and he goes, right, is this something that I can actually apply to something and realize I need to work on and myself? And, you know, sometimes he'd make actions out of it, but it's a different kind of use. It just gave him a moment of self-reflection. There wasn't anything that he actually got out of it.
Yeah, useful for a ritual and a reminder to do some self-reflection. Yeah. One of the other things that was on the statement was that there is no mechanism to explain how it could be real. So if you think back to times when science has made a discovery that something is true, like we think gravity is true, we think gravity is real, it's there, we see its effects, but we still can't explain it. We can't give the mechanism by which it works, just how it works.
Yeah.
So that's the same with astrology.
So,
I mean, if you think about the Greeks, everything's made of atoms. Well, he was right in a roundabout way.
Yeah.
But there was no mechanism to explain it back then.
No.
So it doesn't mean it's false just because we can't explain it.
No, that's true. Although, I mean, realistically, how could it work? Oh yeah, so like when certain planets are in a certain space, there's a little bit more gravity on you, and that changes your mood, man. But yeah, I mean, it does make sense that can't be a reason that you can just say just because you can't explain it means it's false. But it's interesting to think about how something like that could actually work in any way, shape, or form. And maybe it's a lack of imagination on my part, but
it would only work if there was gods or some greater thing stitched into the universe. But you know, as a mechanical universe, there's just definitely no way to explain it. But again, if the reasoning is you can't explain it, therefore it's false. Well, atoms didn't exist until people could explain
it. Yeah, but they did.
But they did, yeah.
So you could say, well, you know, all the evidence of the universe is naturalism, and there is, you know, everything's determined by laws of cause and effect, and seems to be barely any correlation, let alone an actual cause and effect going on. Therefore, we would conclude that this isn't the case. And it's sort of rewording that one. It's saying the same thing,
but more explicit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the difference, isn't it? It's being more explicit. It's a thoughtful response rather than a flippant response. So those scientists who were rejecting it weren't rejecting it for good reasons. They hadn't done their due diligence, and they probably hadn't even read most of it. They just heard what it was complaining about.
I went,
yeah, I hate astrology. Yeah, put my finger on that. So they weren't being particularly good skeptics because they weren't questioning where they got the information from. They weren't checking the information. Carl Sagan and the philosopher of science were, though, because, yes, they liked the answer, but they, even though they agreed with it, they still didn't accept the reasoning and therefore couldn't put their name to it.
Which makes sense, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
there's even times when I've watched debates on YouTube and stuff like that, and the person I agree with has such bad justifications for their position that I just go, yeah, well, the other guy definitely performed better with than you did. You don't really have any good grounding for your position. You don't seem very well thought out in your position, so.
Yeah, that's it. You got to agree with who you agree with, but you can still be critical of it.
Yeah.
So, Carl Sagan in that instance showed his due diligence.
Mm-hmm.
He showed self-reflection, mindfulness, courage
To speak up. Yeah.
Yeah, courage to question what was just the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'll introduce another idea. He was he was acquiring knowledge because he was being virtuous with it. He was making sure he was taking care of his epistemic responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
which not many people will do. He was making sure that the information that he was signing off on was good information. It was accurate information. And he refused to actually sign on until it was accurate. And if we think about how many people aren't responsible, how many skeptics do we hear that just aren't responsible about what they're passing on? Aaron Ra is a perfect example. He calls himself a skeptic, yet he does the whole atheist only has one definition, which is a wrong argument. So he shouldn't be putting his name on it. He's not being a good skeptic. And he's not being responsible because he has all this influence and he passes on bad information.
Yes. Yeah. Especially when it comes to philosophy and history.
And this shows one virtue is humility, which sort of goes hand in hand with a lot of the others. So be humble. Admit that you might not know everything, because that'll stop you looking further and doing your due diligence. And arrogance. There's the two sort of vices that go with it are arrogance, which is, well, how could I not fucking know that? I'm brilliant, me. And the other side is just not being skeptical at all. Oh, the Earth's flat? Okay, nice one. Yeah, I agree. The Earth's round? Yep, I agree. If you just accept anything that comes your way, so gullibility is a vice.
Yeah. I've known a few people like that in my time who have actually been so gullible. They're the sort that you turn around and you go, did you know gullible's been taken out of the dictionary? And they go, oh, really? Oh, why is that then? And you're just like, come on, how have you not heard that one before?
Yeah.
They tend to be really sweet people when they're that gullible, though.
Yes.
I'd almost prefer to have a conversation with them than someone who is, overly arrogant and self-righteous and
Yeah, that's it. It's when you're dealing with somebody who is just accepting anything you say, there's a kind of humor to it. But when it's arrogance, it gets to you because it's like, well, you're so wrong and so arrogant about it. You kind of need to be brought down a peg or two so you can start to actually realize that you know what I mean? Where unless the sort of really innocent guy is going to get himself into harm, he does no harm.
Yeah, that's fair.
But they are fun.
Yes. I've had a few conversations off the back of my new article recently with people who I'd probably put in the arrogant camp, and a few conversations with people who definitely haven't been as well. You know, even though they disagreed with what I've said because they're theists, a couple of good conversations, and a couple of people who are so determined that they're right. They're quote mining articles to get their point across. And you go, I have just read this article, and it, you know, it says all of this information. You're saying it's been proven when it hasn't. They first of all they said that they basically quoted, I think it was Stephen Hawking, saying that Stephen Hawking proved that time had a beginning, and his actual point there was that it you know, it seems most likely that it's you know, we're a self-contained universe that started with no outside influence. So this theist was arguing using Stephen Hawking, who said that this was evidence that there wasn't a creator, to say that there was a creator. And then links to a different article about someone saying, yeah, look, and with a quote saying, yeah, see, it's been proven. It was an older article, and there's newer stuff on it since then. And even within this article, it spoke about different theories of time. And it was just like, so... And then their excuse there was, well, yeah, of course scientists are going to try and disprove this theory because it proves God. It's like whatever.
The theory already did. Yeah. So yeah, that's a great example of arrogance, though. Do you know what I mean? It's not doing your due diligence on the evidence that you're using. It's just going, yeah, this little bit agrees with me, so that'll fucking do.
Yeah. Lone Wolf says, irony is walking in and demanding answers from the host during an explanation of humility and arrogance. Bible says punctuality is a virtue. That's in reference to Lone Wolf being late. So yeah, folks, do you have any questions at this time? Let us know. Kimo says theological time differs wildly from geological time. Time is affected by gravity anyway. So if we're talking about the geology of Earth, it's, you know, a little bit different the further away you get from it. But I don't want to get into a conversation about time. It's not something that I actually know enough about. I've read a few books on it, including Hawkins' Briefer History of Time. In fact, I read Brief History of Time, then Briefer History of Time, because it had some updates, but it, you know, it was a little bit shorter as well, and a couple of other bits on it. And do you know what? Yeah, it's complicated, man.
Yeah, to be honest, it's more than I can wrap my head around. I like the nice, easy philosophical version where it's just, is it A or B?
Yeah,
that'll do.
I just tend to go with Ford prefects. Time is an illusion, lunchtime doubly so.
Yeah.
There you go, done. Lone Wolf says, Joe, my review of your article was the most apt. You may disregard all the rest, and I say this humbly. His review actually was absolutely fantastic, and I'll bring it up a little bit later. But I've already veered us away a little bit too much from the actual point. It was the arrogance side of things, and then I got caught up talking about time. Sorry.
Don't worry. We are used to these kind of tangents.
Yeah.
It's a part and parcel of the show.
So bring us back on track, Dave.
Okay. If a baby falls onto a train track and it's run over by the train, is it ethical to eat what's left?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, unless the parents want the corpse.
Yeah, but it's roadkill, so it's fair game.
Well, it's not roadkill. It's been killed by a tram. It's been killed on track. It's track kill.
Same difference. A road is a thing that things drive on. There you go. That was my unitary description.
So if I drive into your house is now a road.
Well, yeah, smashed up road, but you know. Yeah, so anyway, that was an example of sort of when skepticism is being used and when it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, if you think about it, that's by some pretty smart people, you know, who call themselves skeptics and aren't doing the skepticism. So this would argue that skepticism is more than just
doubt.
Doubt, yeah. Even though that's a big part of it.
Yep.
You have to be doing it correctly, because if you're doubting things you like, you're not really being a skeptic. So you have to constantly be thinking about it. And skepticism is a thing that we do. And we still have to fulfill all these factors to be able to say that we're being a skeptic. So it seems to also, if you're thoughtful about it, it becomes that, like virtue ethics, it becomes a habit. It becomes a disposition, and it becomes something you start to do more regularly. So I would say virtue epistemology and the practice of it makes you a better skeptic.
Yeah. I'd say there's a lot of things that can make you a better skeptic, but this definitely seems like one of them.
And it seems to represent skepticism as well. Like, saying skepticism is just having this set of principles that you follow.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It's something that we do. There are these principles, but they come from the virtues. So, like I say, it seems to be a better definition and a better use of skepticism.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. But so, whilst skepticism can be used in this virtuous way, could it become a vice? You know, would you say something like perhaps Pyrrhonian or academic skepticism is potentially a vice kind of skepticism?
Yeah, according to virtue ethics, it kind of would be, because they're not doing their due diligence, they're not being open-minded. And part of the due diligence would be to look at it and see how, you know, how we go about getting knowledge and saying, well, sure, we could have these major doubts, but look, if we acquire this knowledge virtuously, it seems to be a species of knowledge. And so, yeah, because they're saying, well, it's either all or nothing, they're not being brave, they're not being honest, you know, they're just not doing the actual proper part. So because they're breaking some of the virtues, it becomes a vice. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And would you say the same sort of thing about sort of hyper-evidentialism as well?
I would, because if you think about how we behave as the bus bin, nah, you haven't missed it. Okay, nice one. Oh, wait. Hyper-evidentialism means that, you know, if our beliefs and our knowledge kind of guide our actions, then knowledge would say, if you follow this hyper-evidentialism, well, if there's no evidence, I have no good reason to believe it. So you have no good reason to stand and wait at the bus stop if somebody doesn't provide you footage of the bus not going by.
Yeah, which is ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah, you know. So reason would dictate you would go home and come back next time, because, well, no evidence, there's no proof that it hasn't gone. So I lack belief that the bus hasn't gone by. So I'm going to go home. So, yeah. And sorry, I'm a bit dazed and confused this evening. Just a bit tired.
Sorry, Dave.
Oh, no, it's all good. What were we talking about?
Skepticism as a vice. So,
as a vice, yeah. So you wouldn't have acquired the knowledge virtuously. And one of the other things that much skepticism has is, or other things like, why should I want to, like not have these ideals? Well, being virtuous is good in and of itself, isn't it? Being a good person is good. So
Hmm.
if we consider these epistemic goods, you should be wanting to follow them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So doubting them means, well, you're not really doing your thing and you should be wanting to be. So it encourages it encourages us to be better thinkers too.
Yeah.
Sort of
Yeah.
like, why be good if there's no God? Well, there's all these other reasons. So this is why you should want to be good.
Yeah. That makes sense. So, from it being skepticism as a vice, is it basically just too much skepticism, like going overboard with it, having your requirements for evidence, for example, being too much, or not applying the other virtues to your acquisition of knowledge. Um, Perhaps saying that from a like we said, academic or Pyrrhonian, epistemic nihilism, perhaps. Um, we could possibly say that that is skepticism as a vice, and the other way, is it only gullibility, not being skeptical at all or enough, or is there another vice of skepticism there could be?
I think you could probably call it whatever you want on the other side, like being too gullible, or there probably is a much better word for it, but basically, being so open-minded that your brain falls out. An example of that. Yeah.
Perhaps overly trusting of other people, just accepting everything that they say. You might think you have a justification. It might not actually be pure gullibility. You might have some form of justification why you trust them, but you're still not doing your due diligence in verifying what they're saying. You're just accepting them because you trust them.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and if you think about it, imagine it's somebody you keep trusting over and over, um, but you've seen them not screw you over, but screw other people over, say.
Yeah.
It would make you want to, it should make you want to think, well, maybe he's not the person to be trusted all the time. Like, even if they've never done anything to you, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, 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 that's fair. I mean, depends on the context, obviously, as with pretty much everything. But yeah, if there's someone who does constantly screw over other people, you have to think, well, they're eventually going to do it to me if I keep them close enough or let
Yeah,
them in enough.
yeah, yeah. Or like, say, lending somebody money, you know, say you've lent this person money over and over, and they still keep saying to you, I'll pay you back next week. I'll pay you back next week.
And they ask
When they come
again.
up, yeah, being a good kind of virtue epistemologist, you would think, well, no, I shouldn't be. He's obvious. All the evidence goes against what he's saying. So, you know,
Mm.
and again, you would have to have courage to be able to say, I'm not giving you the money. So the knowledge is being used in a courageous way. And it's been gotten to in a courageous way because you've questioned somebody that normally wouldn't be questioned.
Yeah, and that's actually a very difficult conversation to have with some people, especially. Um, Money can definitely get in the way of friendships quite easily.
Yeah, yeah.
um, Mark, in regards to the bus, says, in my case, I think the bus has gone by already, so I'll walk away only to see the bus go by after I start walking.
Always the way. It's like two buses coming at once.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I used to get the bus to school, and they did breakfast there, so I used to like getting there really early, and there was this one there was only one bus that went to my school from where I lived, and it was always one of those ones where you'd sit there, and sometimes I'd get up at 6 a.m. because I really, really, really wanted the bacon sandwiches they sold at school, and I'd be there, and the bus is supposed to come every 20 minutes, and sometimes I'd be waiting hour and a half. And this was a time when you didn't have things like mobile phones or anything like that to keep you entertained. And sometimes it got to the point where I was like, oh well, my mum's awake now. I'm going to do the 15-minute walk home and get a lift with her. And nearly every time I decided to walk away, 2 or 3 buses would just come down all at once, and you're like, what? But yeah.
Yeah, see, we're right in the countryside. They only go every like 2 hours. So they never come along 2 at once. Not come along, maybe, but
they're better now as well. At least around here and where I used to live, they've all got GPS tracking on them, so if your bus is actually late or if it hasn't been there or anything like that. You've actually got some evidence in the palm of your hand and with the digital readouts that can track what's actually going on with the bus.
Yeah, we've got that here now as well. It's pretty good.
Yeah, it makes things a lot easier. Mark says the solution to the bus thing is to buy a car. Yeah, you need a license for that. No, I don't have one of those. Although I did buy a car for my wife, so I get her to drive. Who screwed up the AM/PM scheduling before? Me. So yeah, when I'm setting up the schedule, I do it from Restream, and sometimes it sets itself back to AM, and then I change it, and it sets itself back to AM again, and I didn't notice that it had done that, and I actually contacted their support today, and they said, no, you can't reschedule the events. So what it used to do was actually, if you miss your schedule by half an hour, it would completely delete all the videos, but they've stopped doing that, which is nice. And I manually changed it on YouTube. That's it. And I was a bit worried actually, because sometimes when you change details like that on YouTube, it can actually mess up the connection, even though it shouldn't. It should all just be done through this key that broadcasts it out, but sometimes it just stops the connection working. So yeah, but yeah, it was me. It was my fault. I didn't do my due diligence and check that it had gone in right.
So you didn't know it was on at 9 p.m. tonight?
Yeah, 9 a.m.
Yeah.
Until I checked today and went, oh, bugger. A based Catholic says atheism is cringe. Cool story.
Yeah, I've already hidden him because he obviously, nothing in that says atheism. Do you know what I mean?
No.
So, wasn't even responding to the stream.
No, pretty pointless. I get that we are atheists, and yeah, great. But most of what we discuss isn't necessarily related to atheism in any way. We discuss all sorts of types of philosophy and science, and when we do have conversations about atheism or justifications and things like that, yeah, feel free to come in and have a conversation with us about that sort of thing. But it's pretty silly jumping onto any old channel that you go, oh, they're atheists, so I'm gonna go, ooh.
Yeah, it's just as bad as atheists doing it to like Christian channels. Yeah.
Pointless behavior, really. But there you go. And hello there, Brachia Monkley as well. Nice to have you here. Oh, Mark's giving me a pass on my fuck up. Thank you. So, skepticism, back to what we were discussing, it definitely can be a virtue, and it can become a vice. It can become a vice in the sense that you can be far too skeptical, and you doubt everything.
Yeah, but they also use a different theory of knowledge. So in that theory of knowledge, that skepticism kind of applies, thinking back to the language games we had the discussion of. So really, you're kind of using this kind of skepticism as an outside observer to that kind of skepticism and not playing in that game. But what you can say is, well, look, I might be playing a different game, but my game solves the puzzle of your game.
Yeah, that's fair. I do find it difficult to broach the topic of skepticism that to someone who thinks skepticism is just doubt or doubting when you don't have evidence, and evidence has to be scientific evidence. So that there's a bit more to skepticism than that.
Yeah.
Even if you're not talking about this kind of skepticism, and you're looking at some of the ones that we've even said, like academic skepticism, but then there's Cartesian skepticism, Humean skepticism, and all of that. There's so many different kinds, and there's different layers to it. And I think that when you look into them, there is almost to some of them, obviously not the ones that we've already said no to tonight, but there is almost sort of a balance of virtue in there, almost implicitly, even if it not explicitly. And this doubting things without scientific evidence, it's
like you said, it's being too skeptical. How can I put it? If you think about Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now, he's not talking about all claims with that. So you could kind of draw an inference that what he's saying is outlandish claims need the outlandish evidence. Everything else needs the proportional evidence. And if you think about Hume, he says one should kind of proportion your belief to your evidence. So that's a slightly better version because it includes Carl Sagan's extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, because he's basically saying, proportion your belief to the claim. Proportion your evidence to the belief and the evidence to the claim. So, and Hume's covers, your friend says he's going to the shop. Well, that's all the evidence you need.
Yep.
And if you were to apply this extreme skepticism and extreme evidentialism, you'd say, I'm going to the shop. Well, that's a claim. Claims need to be backed up by evidence. Guy says, well, I want to get an arrow bar. Do you have evidence you have the money to go get the arrow bar? Yeah. You'd be making all these incredible demands on people.
Yeah, you'd run out of friends pretty fast.
Nobody would. Yeah, you'd be skeptical that people outside actually existed because everybody would avoid you.
Mark says something similar. If you take skepticism to the extreme, it could be pretty debilitating. A certain amount of faith is essential to lead a functional life, and I mean, I'd agree with that. I'd say that there is I know faith can be one of those dirty words to us atheists, but if you take it as in its rawest meaning of trust, we trust in science, we trust in the building of bridges, we trust in the walls that keep us safe, we trust the technologies, we trust that the bus is going to come even though we probably shouldn't.
But in that case, you'd be proportioning your beliefs to your evidence. You know that the bus is always 10 minutes late on a Wednesday, but it always shows up. If it hasn't shown up after 20, you might as well go home. Yeah.
But he's right. I think skepticism as a vice, it definitely can be. Debilitating.
And we see it used as a vice often online because often the skepticism is arrogant. you're saying something I don't agree with, therefore you must be wrong. There's no humility in it, and there's no, well, maybe I'm wrong. Oftentimes you'll see them. Sorry.
Yeah, you started flashing again. Wait.
Yeah, there we go. I could just see it out of the corner of my eye, and it's yeah. So yeah, and often cases we'll hear skeptics say, "Well, psychologists are wrong when they don't call religion a mental illness." Well, then they're not giving the due respect to the expertise of the person. Now, somebody could say here, "Well, that's just an argument from authority." Okay, what they say might not be true, and you might be having the courage to challenge them. But if you're just some guy at home who hates religious people, chances are you aren't quite as capable of diagnosing mental illness as an expert in the field. So you should be taking that into account.
Most definitely. Most definitely.
And we hear it a lot, don't we?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Well, yeah. I've even heard a conspiracy theory from somebody where it was all psychiatrists and psychologists are in on not classifying religion as a mental illness because they don't want to lose a huge customer base. They don't want to kick up a stink, blah, 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 blah.
God.
It almost sounded like a flat earth conspiracy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, we even got it on our Facebook page for Answers in Reason. It when it automatically posted the video to Luke's What is Psychology stream, someone responded saying not reliable because it won't class religion as a mental illness or something to that effect. And it's just like, really? You're so stuck in this ideology that you have to ignore the science. Someone that says you should trust the science, you're then going to ignore the science because it doesn't agree with you. Do you not see how this is something that you disagree with when other people do it about things like, you know, evolution and dating methods and things like that? I mean, if you have the whole conversation with them, you'll see that they're special pleading.
Yeah, exactly. And it's sort of like what I mentioned earlier with the Carl Sagan thing, you know. If the argument works against them and it works against you, perhaps you should rethink your argument or rethink your thinking or rethink your skepticism, you know.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely. Do you think it's bad to be a member of the Satanic Temple? No?
Not really, no.
No. They do some good stuff. And to be honest, I know a lot of atheists feel the need for community and things like that. They feel they're missing things from religion. And I think it's good that they're organized. And in fact, they've got tax exempt status. So, you know, well done. But no, I don't think there's necessarily anything inherently bad about that. I would like us to do. I'd like there to be a secular community that wasn't in the form of a religion, but in the form of a religion, you do get that tax exempt status. So, you know, unless you're going to set up your community as a form of a charity, which is about the only other way you can be tax exempt, I don't know how else you can do it. And probably setting up a religion is easier, especially in a place like America, where people are so used to being in religion that when they leave it, they're like, "Oh yeah, there's an atheist one. I'll jump on that." But yeah. Sorry, just catching up with the chat. So Kimmo says it is wrong always everywhere and for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence, and that's Clifford's principle. Yeah, see, the thing with this is it doesn't weight what insufficient is and what evidence is. And I think this is something that a lot of atheists and other skeptics online get caught up with. They don't necessarily understand what is meant by evidence. They will only regard scientific evidence as evidence. They might say empirical evidence, but they mean specifically scientific evidence as well, because they'll reject any form of evidence that begins with the senses that isn't testable, repeatable, da 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 da. So they're like, okay, so you're talking about empirical evidence and rejecting empirical evidence at the same time. You mean scientific evidence, right? Okay.
Well, if you think about the case with the mental illness one as well, they're rejecting scientific evidence,
Yeah.
Which is one of the things that they ask for. And it's also rejecting the empirical evidence because they've been the ones doing the actual studies. So it could be considered empirical evidence that they've gathered.
Yeah,
and they're rejecting that too. So, yeah, it seems a ridiculous thing for them to confine. And if they're not doing all that kind of due diligence and fairness and everything, could you really say they are being skeptics?
No, definitely not.
But in that version of skepticism, they would be, if that makes sense, in that core group of people who call themselves skeptics.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the same way that atheism has different uses, doesn't it? And,
yeah, exactly.
If the lack of belief atheist wants to be known as an atheist, you're an atheist. It's not how I would use the term, but I will use the term in your game for you.
And this kind of skepticism shows how, like I said before about the mixing the language games and saying, well, this problem is better answered. But it can be used to show, well, you're using that word, but here's a better use of the word and a better actual idea of skepticism. So really, why aren't you coming into this language game and being this kind of skeptic?
Yeah, no, I agree. Brachia says it's a very bad argument calling religion a mental illness. Yes, definitely is. Do you know what?
Definitely.
Some religious people can be mentally ill. Yeah, so can some non-religious people. So can, some atheists or secular theists or whatever. It doesn't matter who you are. But you shouldn't be stigmatized for having a mental illness either. It will prevent people from actually getting the help that they need. People who are mentally ill deserve compassion. And, people who also used to be theists themselves, when they became atheists, did they suddenly stop being mentally ill? I mean,
some of them probably do believe that, I guess.
But that's not how mental illness really works either. It doesn't just go, oh, I've just changed one belief. There you go. I'm better now.
Yeah, I'm no longer deluded.
Yeah. See, so I'd agree with you. It is a terrible argument. It's one that we fight against quite a lot, even though the pair of us and most of us who are on these streams believe gods don't exist, and I've even done a massive article recently about it. I think there are so many arguments that us atheists use that are absolutely terrible, and we should stop saying. And the religion being a mental illness, or theism being a mental illness, is definitely one of them that we just need to stop.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, in terms of like this virtue epistemology skepticism, if one of the things that they say makes religion a mental illness is that most theists are deluded. And by deluded, they mean they believe false things or they believe things without any evidence. If they're going to do that, then according to virtue skepticism, they should be mindful and apply that to themselves as well. And if they were to do that, they would realize that according to their definition and the way they're using the term, well, they probably fall under deluded as well. Because part of it is being wrong and refusing to change your stance based on evidence. And how many times do we see atheists do that?
Yeah.
Most people believe in numbers.
Yep.
They're not really something that has an existence. They're conceptual.
Mm-hmm.
So they believe in things that don't actually exist. They would fall under a lot of their own categories.
Yeah, definitely. Mark says there are organizations that lead to a sense of community that are not set up like a religion. Take sporting clubs as an example. Yeah, I mean, as long as you're not talking about specific ones, like I know a lot of both American and English football does become quite like a religion for the people in part of it. But yeah, a general sporting club doesn't necessarily do it. And I agree. I just think that there needs to be something like this for people who have left religion and are looking for something, some of that community support, some ways to deal with deaths, and ways to interact with people that sort of maybe think the same, and or they can have a good conversation with. And I mean, we did that episode from the 10 questions for atheists about the atheist or secular community, and there were some great ideas in there that people said, you know, these would be some great things that we'd have in there. And I agree with a lot of what people said there, and I think it would be nice to have that sort of thing. Some people go, oh, well, that's not atheist problem, find a humanist society. Okay, but when I actually looked into that, you know, there was one, the only one that was close to me was a 6-hour drive away, and I don't have a car. And my problem with the humanist society is they tend to be dealing with a lot more overseas stuff. There's not much local action, and I'd like to get involved in something that does local action. And I've got friends that actually who are atheists but work with their local churches because they've got the infrastructure there to have those charity events and do these things, and they want to be involved with their community and do these things, and the only way they can do it is through the church. And I do wish that there was the opportunity for us atheists to do stuff like that more locally. So that's where I was going with that. Will you just answer any weird question we ask? Is this a new game? Yes, probably. I like the weird questions. They add
Kind of
a
known
bit of
for it.
fun. Yeah. Come on, Dave. You know you've been watching us for how long now? You know full well that's what we do.
He doesn't really watch. He just comes into the chat and posts a random question
Yeah,
and then
probably.
goes.
So Brachia says, oh, a 10 questions thing, have to look that up. Yeah, so we've done a 10 questions for theists and a 10 questions for atheists / non-theists, and we've been going through recording responses to each question. So there's a playlist of the video responses to the 10 questions, and there's our responses to their responses, basically, that we're going through, and we've recorded and produced up to question 8 on both of them now. So yeah, we do need to get the last few ones sorted, but you know, time and energy are things that are difficult to come by. Have I considered getting a license? I mean, if others can do it, so can you. I have faith in your ability, even if you don't. Yeah, but I like drinking. That's pretty much as far as that one goes. So, were there any more examples you wanted to cover, Dave?
I mean, there's loads out there when we think about just how the skeptic community is. Like, I know we constantly talk about the atheism definition, but like I just mentioned about Aaron Ra and how he's not doing his epistemic responsibility, we can see the knock-on effect of that coming to the community at large, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And they see Aaron Ra being arrogant about it. So they think, well, he must be true. You know, he has this unshakable belief. So he's causing harm. So part of being virtue, a virtue epistemologist, is reducing the harm that the knowledge that you give out is, because, you know, it's not virtuous to cause harm, and it's not virtuous to cause intellectual harm either.
Mm.
And those atheists don't do their due diligence, so they're not being properly skeptical. They're not being open-minded, because how many times have we been blocked for even saying it? And they're not being humble. So they don't fit any of those kind of things of skeptic. So they have to make a choice then. Are you a skeptic, or are you just a lack of belief atheist? Can't be both. At least not according to a virtual epistemology type stance.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And if you think about it, one of the other common things that many of those skeptics will say is, I want to believe as many true things as possible, and as many
Yes.
false things as possible.
Yeah.
Not
And
believe.
not
Yeah.
believe, yeah, I knew what you meant.
Yeah.
But probably good to be explicit.
Yeah. Somebody will call me out on it. So they're also not being honest in their own stances either. So they're not being a particularly good skeptic. And that statement alone should make them want to be a better skeptic and adopt this kind of virtue epistemology type approach to skepticism, because their skepticism is obviously stopping them from learning something new, which isn't virtuous.
No,
And it's
definitely
not.
not.
Yeah, it's not doing your due diligence, not living up to your own claims, etc., etc.
And I think that comes back to the conversation about evidence again as well, doesn't it? Because, you know, another one that we hear is evidence will change my mind. You'll provide evidence. That's not evidence. That's just an opinion, or you know,
Yeah, exactly.
You get something like that, and you're like, well, no, this is evidence. This is a number of different philosophical papers on this particular topic, and it's a philosophical topic. So, you know. And you're like, no, it can only be scientific evidence or something like, okay. So the only kind of evidence is scientific evidence. So how do you scientifically justify what scientific evidence is?
Yeah, that's it. There is no object to examine. Yeah.
No, exactly. So someone has to propose what this particular evidence is. So you take it back to what evidence actually is, and we talk about this time and time again. It's anything that raises or lowers the probability of a conclusion or a hypothesis being true or false, basically. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's strong evidence. But there's so many different things that you can consider evidence and then say that evidence is so weak it doesn't convince me, or that evidence is weak and it's countered by this other piece of evidence that is much stronger. So therefore, even though there's this evidence here, I conclude that this evidence doesn't work and this evidence does. So it's like we'd say various holy books are evidence for the religion. It's not particularly good evidence. There's errors in them and all sorts. There's so many problems with variety of holy texts, but they are still a body of evidence to support a particular religion.
Exactly. And adopting this sort of virtual epistemology stance towards skepticism would allow them to learn that. It would strip away many of the dogmas that we see in the sort of atheist and skeptic community at large.
Yeah, and it's so unfortunate to see them. And when you point them out, no, atheism has no dogma. So, okay, maybe it doesn't, but the atheist community online seems to have a lot of dogma. There is no atheist community. Yeah, that's one of them.
Is a dogma in itself, yeah. I mean, I suppose you could think of it in terms of, like, say, a sort of language game where board game, ball game, trivia game. Atheism has a sort of similar thing, not just soft and hard atheism, not just lacktheism, but you can break those down into smaller groups, like the group that watches so-and-so, the group that exists in this Facebook group. There's dogmas in those sort of communities.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, and that's just it. There are. You can't tar all atheists with the same brush, and even when I'm talking about internet atheists, I mean we're internet atheists ourselves, but we'd say that there's a number of these behaviors that we don't do ourselves. I can even say that I have been in those groups and I've demonstrated some of those behaviors in the past, and At least not anymore. I'm not ashamed to admit it. It was a learning curve for me, I guess. I have said plenty of dumb things throughout my life, and I have been a bit of a keyboard warrior dick, and now hopefully I'm just an endearing dick. I hope. But yeah. Oh, Craig, how you doing, buddy? He's come to destroy us. And Rev as well. How you doing? So the no true humble Scotsman fallacy, Dave. So that was in response to humility can be a vice, and he says when it becomes a vice, this is you, Dave. It's not humility anymore; it's false humility. And then
it's pretending to have humility.
Yeah.
No.
Nicely done. Is it starting to give way, or yeah, it's fallen out? Oh no, Dave, we're gonna have to do a fundraiser, get you a new mic. Kimo says being overprudent can be a thing as well. Yeah, I mean, with any virtue, it has a way of becoming a vice. So prudence is one of the most important virtues, I'd say. Or temperance, I sort of include them in sort of, there's a crossover between them, but you can be so prudent, you're just so overly cautious that again you get a form of I can't think of the word now when you're frozen. What's it called?
Petrified.
Like when you're petrified, but yeah, okay. You just can't make any actions because you're too cautious. I can't think of the word in my head. It's there.
I can relate to that.
Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah, about the mic. I've got a new stand coming tomorrow.
Oh, okay, awesome. Got a bit too excited with it recently, have we?
Well, it's been like that for about 3 or 4 months.
I do remember it happening when we were recording the videos. I managed to include it as one of the end clips as a little bonus.
Nice one.
Yeah, Joe was a keyboard warrior dick. Nothing has changed except he's not a keyboard warrior. Exactly. I'm still a dick. Just hopefully, not that kind of dick. Immobilized, yeah, sort of. I'm thinking along the lines, Dave, of when if you were to say that you had no beliefs, if you truly had no beliefs, you would be frozen. You couldn't make any decisions.
To me.
You couldn't get out of bed because you wouldn't trust that the floor's actually there, and
yeah, I can't remember what the word is though.
Yeah, it's there in my head.
I use it when I talk about the ontology and value pluralism. So normally it's there, but it's just not coming to me.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've infected you with my
or my senility's catching on you.
Yeah, could be. So Kimo says, kind of like Zuck. Oh no, not Zuck. Kind of like being stuck in Zugzwang in chess. You absolutely don't want to take your next turn. Zugzwang, I don't know what that is in chess. So I'm going to have to look that up. I do enjoy a game of chess. I haven't really played it in years. I'm not particularly amazing. I beat people more when I'm drunk, oddly. Probably because I'm so unpredictable. I'm good at poker when I'm drunk too. Terrible at it the rest of the time. Anytime I think about it and play tactically, no. Get drunk, I win. Weird. So, Dave, is there anything else you think that we should cover off in tonight's episode?
Well, there's a couple more points to make. One is that this form of epistemology seems to be a good representation of how we work psychologically.
Mm-hmm.
And to some sense, also the same kind of skepticism, the same can be said with the skepticism. And that is generally how skepticism should work, but also generally how we are skeptical in and of ourselves. Like most people aren't radical skeptics.
Mm-hmm.
They're just, you saw a UFO, seems a bit unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
That, so it's a good representation of that. And most people think, I've got hands. It doesn't matter that I could be an illusion. I've got hands. I know I have hands. And say, I know that the timer's going to go off in the oven in half an hour and I'm going to have like some sausages or something. It kind of feels silly to say, well, you could be in the Matrix and those might not be real.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's still going to go off in half an hour and I'm still going to have sausages, and it feels daft to say, I don't know I'm going to have those sausages.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems to be a good representation of knowledge and skepticism in general and how it ought to work, not just how it does work. So it gives us a sort of normative sense to skepticism, and a normative sense to acquiring knowledge,
Mm.
how to be the best knowledge seeker and gatherer and gainer.
And if you
And
focus on it, it can really refine those qualities
how you
as
do it,
well.
yeah, and your skills. And it becomes a habit. Like I say, it becomes a disposition, and you start becoming good at it without having to think about it.
Much in the way we were discussing virtue ethics before, how it becomes like manners. You're taught manners from such a young age that they become automatic. Virtues you have to think about a little bit more and understand why for them to really be a moral behavior. But eventually you just start acting that way because you're so used to doing those things. And I suppose the same is for virtue epistemology. The more you train yourself to think in a certain way and refine these skills, the more you will automatically do these things.
Exactly. And that's basically, virtue epistemology is sort of based off virtue ethics. And Aristotle has talked about it, back then. But it's really becoming its own thing these days. It's being really refined, sort of like virtue ethics is having a bit of a comeback these days.
Mm.
And I think because there's a certain pragmatic element to it as well. It feels like it gets us to good knowledge. It feels very useful. So it is making a bit of a comeback. And I can see why.
Definitely. And was any of this what inspired you to do the dissertation you did? Or is it the other way around?
Sort of.
Oh, it is.
Sort of, yeah. But my dissertation is knowledge virtue.
Yeah.
And it isn't based on virtue epistemology. It's based. It is a discussion about virtue ethics itself, and is virtue a form of knowledge? Not is knowledge a form of virtue? I know it seems a bit subtle, but it's just looking. My dissertation was just looking at whether virtue is something we know, or can know. And of course it is, because you have to think about it. You have to understand what it is. And it's a sort of practical knowledge. And you could sort of say the same about virtue epistemology. It's practical knowledge about knowledge.
Meta-knowledge.
Meta-knowledge, yeah. And if you think about it this way, even if you don't accept that virtue epistemology gets you to knowledge, like I say, it's very practical and it's very useful. So even if you don't think it gets you to knowledge, it gets you to being, as you said, a better knowledge gainer.
Yeah. Just improve your thinking skills.
Yeah, you become a better critical thinker because of it.
Something people should look into. Oh, I did actually notice, as we're talking about critical thinking, it might have gone now, but Stephen Law's critical thinking on Udemy was $12.99 again.
Nice one. I might actually go for it this time. I've got a bit of money now, so
yeah. Hopefully it hasn't gone back up in price, but it's definitely one that I think would be worth taking.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite philosophers.
Dude's a legend.
He is, and he's like a really cool guy as well. That's what makes him one of my favorites. He's just so laid back about it, and you sense the knowledge coming out of him, not by the way he speaks or the words he used, but by just how clearly he can speak.
Yeah, yeah. He can explain things that I understand. He explains things that kids could understand. You know.
Exactly. He's very useful to me when I was doing my undergrad because of it.
Yeah. So yeah, if any of you are not following Stephen Law and have not read any of his books or papers or anything like that, definitely check him out. Stephen Law's awesome. I think
He
on
is.
Twitter he's Stephen Law 60, is it?
Yeah.
But yeah. Something that might be interesting. There's the cartoon version of his Evil God Challenge, which is really worth watching as well. It sort of throws the perfectly good God into question, by proposing a perfectly evil God. So it explains it from the other end, and it's brilliant, really. It's a nice way to think about it. And if any of you have kids, get the complete philosophy files. They're brilliant as well.
Yeah. Another argument of his that's worth looking up. I'm not sure if it's his own argument. I think he's refined it, or he might have come up with it. But it's the Pandora's Box challenge for skeptical theism, where if you allow for skeptical theism, you allow for all these kinds of evils that can be described as goods, simply because they might have come from God. They might be God doing a test. They might be God testing you. You know what I mean?
Mm. That's a good one. I need to check that one out myself. He also did one on Psychology Today, about proving a negative, which puts things in very clear terms about proving a negative. And it's another one it's another catchphrase that we hear from skeptics about how you can't prove a negative. And it's like, we can explain it to them so many different ways you can prove negatives, and they end up moving the goalposts each time. And I'm like, look, if really what you want to say is you can't prove a metaphysical entity doesn't exist without a doubt, unless then that's fine. And even then you could, because there could be logical contradictions within that entity. But if you're saying, a very generalistic version of this metaphysical entity, a generalistic version can't exist without that, that's fine. But then there's no real power in that statement, is there? Because what they're trying to say is, well, I can't prove I can't do the work. It's impossible to do this work, so I'm not going to do it, because you have to prove your side. It's, again, they're not being particularly good skeptics by doing this. They're not really dealing with their epistemic responsibility and justifying why they discount the other person. And and it goes back into the whole, well, that's not good enough evidence, that's not evidence, and it needs to be scientific.
Yeah.
There's this circle that seems to go on, especially on the online atheist community, that it's a bit of a shame, really.
Yeah, I suppose virtue-based skepticism would sort of ruin some of that. Like, not for us, it'd make it better for us, but it would ruin it for them, because the way they're going about not acquiring what they think is knowledge is in a non-virtuous way. It's in an arrogant, aggressive. It's not being gotten to virtuously. They're just arguing for the sake of arguing, and not being epistemically irresponsible by making bad arguments. So yeah, maybe a lot of skeptics won't like virtue-based skepticism.
What, you mean I have to put some effort in? Oh, man.
I have to be a good thinker to be a skeptic? I can't say wrong things and pass on bad information? No, not for me, mate.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's pretty much it. It's I suppose I can finish up just saying, look into virtue epistemology, look into skepticism as a virtue, because that's one way to become the best skeptic you can be. And if you want to be the best skeptic, and why wouldn't you want to be the best skeptic you could be? Here's a way to do it. Even if you don't think it gets you to knowledge, it will certainly improve your critical thinking and how you look at knowledge, and improve your behavior as a skeptic.
Yeah, definitely. So, on that note, was there anything that you wanted else to say before we left for the evening?
Nope, that's good. Nope, it's good.
Awesome. So before we go, I would just like to say to everybody, if you didn't catch, what was it? Tuesday's stream on language games. It ties in nicely to tonight, as well as the previous stream about skepticism as well. So hopefully you can check both of those out, and we'll see you next week. Have a good night, all.
Good night, all.